Hi, my name's Alyssa and I'm from the Brisbane Synapse office. Thank you for coming along to the September edition of SynapseCarers. The topics for our monthly support sessions came about as a result of the Carers Advisory Group and surveys. So we know that this topic is something that carers are interested in learning more about. Today we have Joe speaking to the group live in Brisbane, Parramatta, Port Macquarie and Gosford. If you're watching from home or the other hubs, you can ask questions through the comment section of the YouTube live stream, and I'll ask these questions at the end. To introduce Joe, Joe has over 15 years' experience within the government and community sectors. Her experience is strongly grounded in community capacity building and supporting community responses to realise health and social outcomes within a variety of settings. Joe was involved in a project to support collaboration between tenants and their support network to plan personal goals, maintain and develop networks, and provide the practical support for each tenant to live well in their own apartment and community. This is a true person centred approach to housing. Her experience includes managing housing and support portfolios within Victoria and more recently Queensland. Joe currently holds the role of Housing and Support Manager at Synapse and has extensive involvement in the transition of housing and support models within an NDIS context, including supported independent living quotes and specialist disability accommodation registration. Joe also has significant involvement within Synapse's housing and support model in Cairns, Australia's first purpose built, culturally responsive housing service for Indigenous Australians impacted by brain injury. I would now like to hand over to Joe to talk on her topic of imagining possibilities for living differently. Joe?
Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you for the introduction. That was lovely. Okay, so I'm just getting my tech brain happening. Okay, cool. So we would first like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands upon which we are coming together here today and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. So this is a bit of info around Synapse, which you may or may not be aware of. But I guess the thing that really sticks out for me is the last paragraph. So it's about connecting with communities and partners. So I think for me, from my perspective, this is what I really love about working with Synapse, that notion of us waiting to be invited in, um, and then working with people to identify a need. Synapse is then able to see if they can address that need. So it's not about us pushing our way into people's lives. It's about that real understanding of what the needs are and then determining if we can meet that or if there is someone else or some other organisation that can help with that. So I guess in relation to housing, there's quite a few things that most people would know. Um, and I think I'm talking about my experience over the last 15 plus years, and there's been some significant changes, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done. So I guess the top 2 points are around requirements that are largely inflexible for people. And when I look at those points, I think largely around the group home arrangement or supported accommodation, which can really create barriers for people to, I think differently and to explore creative and flexible ways of how people choose to live. And I remember meeting with a mother many years ago. Her son was living at home with her at the time, and he was in his 30s. And she was looking at housing options for him. But in her mind, her only option was that group home environment because her number one priority for her son was that she wanted him to be safe. And safety meant to her that he was, I guess, supervised 24 hours a day. So I think that really stuck out to me because I think a lot of people don't know what they don't know. They don't know what else is out there. And I guess safety being a huge driver for families and carers, which is completely understandable. But it sometimes it challenges people to sort of look outside the square and think a little bit differently. I think in relation to government and welfare groups and things like that, um, often people with a brain injury are grouped in with people with a developmental disability, so an intellectual disability or autism or Down syndrome and things like that. And I guess in my experience, and I'm sure everybody's experience, it's not the same. It's a very different level of support that is required and a different way of working with people. Uh, and I think that's also very challenging when you're working with government agencies and community organisations that may not understand the context and may not, I guess, see that difference and be able to understand that it requires a very different response to those kind of supports. And I will probably touch throughout the presentation around housing and support. So, from my perspective, housing and support are very separate. So, housing I refer to as, I guess, the physical structure, so the bricks and mortar, and the support is, I guess, how people are enabled to live a life that they choose and what it actually takes to be a tenant and to live in a home that you choose. I think the point number five around the balance between risk and quality of life. So, I guess what I've seen in my experience, particularly when working with government organisations, is that there is a huge drive to minimise risk, which often results in huge, I guess, increases in compliance. And everything is about minimising risk. And I think from my learnings and experience, it's really about looking at the dignity of risk. So understanding that yes, there are risks associated, uh, but because we identify a risk, it doesn't then mean that we can't do it and we have to, I guess, impose all of these things on people and tenants. So it's a really difficult one to work through. Um, but I think that's really important to understand that there may be risk associated, but it needs to be addressed in a safe way, and there can be some risk, as long as there are plans in place around how to, I guess, minimise that as much as possible without taking people's rights and choices away. Uh, it also reminds me of a story. I knew of a man who had a brain injury and he found his own place and he signed his tenancy like everybody else would, and he went through the real estate, did what he needed to do. Because of, I guess, some of the issues around his vulnerability and his real drive to have friends, he invited people into his home. And what we found out later on was that those people were actually squatters. So they pretended that, we want to be your friend and we want to hang out and we want to do all these things. It then got to a point where they actually didn't leave. And as a result, this man lost his tenancy because of, I guess, inviting people in. Um, and I think that's a real risk that we obviously need to acknowledge as well, that there are complexities around those things. And having your own home is great and you have the independence, but it also potentially introduces more risks, some that you may think about, some that you may not even realize until it happens. I think also that notion around a good life. I mean, everyone is entitled to a good life, but understanding, I think, particularly with housing, that things change. So I know for myself, I've lived in many different places, many different houses, many different arrangements over the years, and I think there is an assumption that for people who require supports, that they find a house and then they live there until the end of their life. Um, I know that's definitely not the case for me. As I said, I've moved interstate. I've lived with people. I've lived with myself on my own. So I think it's understanding as well that what might work for a particular person at a particular point in time may change over time, and that's okay, because I guess that's everyday life for people. Um, can be really scary at times, but I think it's also understanding that you may not necessarily find the best housing solution straight away, but it's always about looking at, okay, well, I've done this now, what's next? And not be limited by it's all too hard and I want to stay here, and or I need to stay here until I'm old enough to go into a nursing home kind of thing. And I think probably what I will talk on a lot is very much around connections to people and relationships, because I think from my experience, and that's what I'm very passionate about, that's that's the thing that really enables success for people. We can have the best house in the world, but if the supports and the connections are not there, it may not be successful. And I guess on the flip side, you can have the best people around, but if you have a house that doesn't work for you, that also doesn't really give you the best chance of success. So I think my discussion today or my presentation is very much around asking different questions of yourself and trying to think a little bit outside the box, and thinking around what is possible to achieve beyond your usual capability and experience. So we know, I guess, the standard models of support that are out there, but asking yourself, what is it that I want for myself or for my loved one when I think about the notion of home? What are those things that are important, and and how do I get there? What do I need so I can get there and make sure that this person that I'm supporting or working with is actually living a life that they choose? And I guess I will bang on about this, so I do apologize, but uh, we obviously achieve so much more by being honest and real with each other and working towards a common goal. And I think this is really huge for me. And I think acknowledging as well that the whole notion of housing, it's actually really really hard for, I guess, people with brain injury, but also for care. Like it's huge. It is a really huge thing, and it's scary, and a lot of it is unknown. And there's on us, well, on a, I guess probably a lot of the time there is that notion of, what if it doesn't work? What if I try this and it doesn't work? Then we have to go back to square one. So I think from my perspective, it's just about being honest in that case and saying, yeah, this might be really scary and really hard, but this is the goal that I want to get to. This is what I want for my loved one or for myself, and I'm gonna I'm gonna try really hard to get there. So it's about really focusing, and I often say, keep your eye on the prize. This is what I want, and whether it takes a year or 5 years or 10 years, this is where I'm going, and I'm going to keep moving. Um, I think also acknowledging that it can take a really long time. And from my experience, it's very much based around the needs of the person. So there may be people that, they can work through these things relatively quickly and find a home and get the right supports and be in a place that they choose within 3 months. Other people, it can take years of work. But I think, again, it's based on the individual. And I think if we try and take models that we've seen elsewhere, or ways that people have done things, and replicate them and impose them on other people, it's not necessarily the best outcome. So I think acknowledging as well that it can take time, and that's okay, as long as we're moving and we're progressing with things. I think one of the key things within that as well is acknowledging that, particularly for carers, it's really hard and stressful and exhausting and frustrating at times. And I think what I've seen is, when it works really well, carers and families, they have that network of support. So those people in their lives that can sort of jump in and help them get through those stages where it's actually really hard. So you get to a point you think, I can't do this anymore. I don't even want to think about housing. It's all too much. And having supports in place that can sort of step in and say, I get that it's really hard. What is it that I can do? Or how can I support you just to keep moving that little bit forward? I think that's really important. And obviously realizing that it's not something that one person can just get in and do. Like it's a huge thing, and it's really important to, I guess, identify the connections and make sure that you have a team of people that can really support you, um, and are all on the same page and working towards where you want to go with things. I remember working with a gentleman who moved to Melbourne a few years ago. So he sustained a brain injury in his late 30s. And as a result, he moved back with his parents, who were in regional Victoria, so 4 hours west of Melbourne. Prior to that, he was an avid traveller. He was around the world doing all sorts of things. Sustained a brain injury and then needed quite a bit of support. So the only option for him was to move back with mum and dad. Um, and my role, I guess, within that story, was to work with him around, what is it going to take for you to live in your own home, and what are those things that are going to keep you going, and how do we support you and your family and your friends in getting to where you need to go. And I remember we had our first, I guess, big meeting. We called it a planning meeting, and it was in the apartment that he'd chosen in Melbourne. and there was no furniture, there was nothing because he hadn't actually moved in, but there were 20 people in that room. There were two service providers. So the rest of the people in that room were obviously the gentleman, his family, and his friends and his support network. So I think that's one of the most um, amazing meetings that I've ever been to, seeing a room full of people that are just so dedicated to seeing someone succeed. But what really stuck out to me was, I guess, the ability for people to be honest and upfront and be vulnerable about things. So this gentleman did have I guess, a previous history with drugs and alcohol, and because of the safety in that room and people really wanting the best for that guy, they said it out and they said, "We're really scared that you're going to move to Melbourne away from your family and you're going to get back into that lifestyle." So it was a wonderful, I guess, thing to be involved in and to hear people talk about, I'm really scared about this for you and I really want to work with you and I want to support you, but you've got to tell me how to do that. So by being honest in that conversation, um, the group and not myself, the group was able to work out, okay, so we know that if we see this happening, this person can step in. And so there was I guess, a support network around the person. And then there was also a support network around the support network. But I think the thing that strikes me is that notion of being really honest and upfront and saying, yeah, I am scared about this and I'm really worried about this, and talking it out, and then realizing that yes, it's a risk and it's something we're all afraid of, but we can work it out. And they did a beautiful job of that. They really did. And I guess the big thing as well was the gentleman was at the center of that conversation. So it wasn't a conversation about him. He was in that room and he heard everybody's fears. Um, and it was just an awesome experience for me. Probably one of the highlights of my, I guess, housing career. So if we look at housing options, I guess generally speaking, um, we have nursing home, which, clearly I'm not a fan of. We have long-term residential care. We have supported accommodation or group homes, living with friends or family, a hostel with or without support, your own home with support, and public housing. So I guess because often we want our loved ones to be safe, and it's an absolute driver and very relevant, um, we often choose housing arrangements that may not be ideal. And it's also, I think, because people can be very limited to what they can choose from. And I go back to the story of the mother talking about supported accommodation or group homes because that's all that she knew. Uh, so I think it's really important to see housing, so that physical kind of support, um, as very separate to the support, and work out how they complement each other, um, and how you can, I guess, tweak things and change things around, and not just thinking, okay, well, it's either a group home or a nursing home, particularly for people that are not over the age of 65. Um, and I think that's a national issue. And the housing project that I was involved in Melbourne was in response to that. So demonstrating that people with high and complex needs can actually live in a community that they choose. They don't need to go into a nursing home. Um, so I guess, yeah, just wanted to touch on some of the housing options that are out there. I think in my role at the moment, we have a number of different housing arrangements in place. So we have our traditional supported accommodation. We also have tenants in a private rental, so they manage their lease. Synapse provides the support, and again, we also have our housing model up in Cairns, which is specific for people that are Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. Um, so that model was actually 9 years in the making. It took 9 years to get where we are now. So I guess just flagging that it it can be really, really hard and time consuming. But the outcomes that we're seeing, and the change in people's lives that we're now observing and getting to be a part of, is absolutely amazing. And it's absolutely worth the 9 years of hard work. So as I mentioned before, there's two separate but very connected elements that are likely to produce success for people with a brain injury with their housing options, and that's quality housing and quality support. So, like I said, you can have one that's absolutely fabulous. We've got the most beautiful house in the world. It's accessible. It's near the, I guess, the train line. You can get to the shops. It's near your family. It's all of those things that you love. But if you've got really, I guess, dodgy support, um, it's likely to impact on the success. And I guess on the flip side, you can have the best support team in the world, but if you have a house that you can't get around, um, so whether that's a physical accessibility or social or cultural or anything like that, so it's not just about, I guess, making sure the doors are wide enough and things like that. But if you have a place that you love entertaining people, but you've got no space to do that, it also impacts on the success of being, I guess, a tenant and loving where you live and the support that you're getting to be in that space. I think too also looking at, I guess, maybe the first housing option that comes to mind, and you get into a place and it's okay and the support's really great, but it's not ideal, but at least it's a stepping stone. And I guess I always encourage people that if that's where you need to be for now, that's okay, but not to limit yourself and think, well, it's not great, but I don't really know where else to go, so I'm just going to stay here. So it's very much around, I guess, that stepping stone. And I think for myself, I mean, I moved out of home and I went into a housing arrangement that was okay for the time being. But it also enabled me to think, okay, well, when I move to my next place, this is what I want and this is what's going to be important to me. So I think, and I hate saying this word, but it is almost that journey around, okay, I'm here now and this is working really well. But in a year's time, actually, it's going to be different for me because, things might change and it's okay to be, I guess, never settling and thinking, right, I'm here until I die. It's really about, I guess, what can be done at that point in time, and then what are the things that you're going to move um, to make to make your life as good as you can. So when we talk about quality housing, these are some of the things that I guess I've experienced over the years. And obviously, we talk about the physical design. Um, we talk about that word accessibility, which is very big in, I guess, disability world. We talk about the built environment, including what we would call assistive technology. We look at the location of where the house is. So is it close to people that you want to remain connected with? If you love the beach, is it near the beach? Um, if you need to go, I don't know, and get your hair cut every week, is there a hairdresser that's around? So it's about those kind of things as well. We also look at eligibility. So looking at, are you able to be a tenant and to manage your own lease? And of course, one of the biggest drivers with quality housing is obviously the cost. Can I afford to live in a place that I want to live? Um, my experience with NDIS, and we've recently transitioned, so I'm still quite new to, I guess, the NDIS world in that space. But there is a huge focus on the physical design, um, which is great. But I think it often limits or excludes people that have um, complex requirements that are not necessarily, I guess, about being a wheelchair and having a widened doorway. It's really about the layout and the design of the house, and does that work for a person? So an example I have is the housing model that we're involved in Cairns. So in the unit, so there are 8 independent units on that site, and within the living areas, there's no corners. So all the where we would normally have a corner, it's actually a rounded space. I don't know what you would call it. The reason for that is within Aboriginal cultures, a lot of people think the spirits hide in the corners. So the built design with that model has taken all of those things into account. Um, what we did find though was that the corners in the bedroom were not rounded, so they were your standard. sort of square corners, I guess you'd say, which is it's an issue for a lot of the tenants because that's the place that they sleep. That's where they want to feel the safest, but there's no rounded corners in those bedrooms. So I guess that's another example of it's really good, but it's not perfect, and that's a learning, I guess, for Synapse as well. But in order to, I guess, address that, a number of the tenants have smoking ceremonies, so they can buy sticks of sage and they can smoke particular rooms in their house to get rid of those spirits. So I think my experience with Cairns is very much around the physical design. Also needs to incorporate culture. It's not just about, I guess, people that might have a physical disability. It's all of the other elements that are involved, even things like, sunlight. If you need sunlight and you want to live in a really bright place, having a place that's really dark can really impact on how you feel about where you're living. I think also central to any support model. So when we look at the house and then the support, is having a physical environment which is safe. And I guess my version of safe might be different to other people's versions of safe. So I think it's not just about, no one can get in and I can lock the doors, but it's around when I'm home and I'm on my own potentially, do I feel safe? Do I feel okay? And I think that's a driver for people. It's definitely a driver for me. And I think that's something that really needs to be taken into account when you're looking at quality housing and the physical aspect of that. So quality support. So I've probably had more involvement in the support side of things because I'm obviously not a builder or an architect. I have learnt lots over the years, but support is probably where I have most of that experience. And I think there's many things, but one thing that really stands out to me is that it must be informed by the experiences of tenants. And I will refer to individuals within this presentation as tenants because we're looking at it from that housing perspective. And it has to be led by the tenants. It really, really, it doesn't work if it's driven by everybody else. The tenant has to be involved and lead that process. And they may need a significant amount of support to do that, and that's okay. But it really needs to be based around the tenant's wishes and what they're wanting out of life. Again, as I said before, this can take a really long time, years, years and years. Uh, and what I noticed in some experiences that in order to get to the point where people even feel confident in saying this is what I want in a house, they need to have a level of confidence in doing that. So there are a number of tenants that I've worked with over the years that had really low expectations because no one really challenged them to have anything but low expectations. So, in the housing model in Melbourne, where I was involved, my role was very much around establishing the relationship with the tenant and getting them to really raise their expectations. And in order to do that, they needed a level of confidence. So, I think a lot of the tenants that I had supported were very, very frightened that if they raised expectations and they maybe said, "Oh, I'm not happy with this," or I want this, or I don't want this, they were really frightened that they would lose their support as a result. So they didn't say anything. So they just pretty much took what they were offered, and that was really it. Um, so I think the focus and the work that I did with tenants was very much around getting to the point where people actually feel confident in asking and telling people what they want, which I think it's a game changer for many, many people. Um, so I think I guess that's probably one takeaway. If you get nothing else, it's very much around raise people's expectations, raise your own expectations as well, and don't just settle for what everybody else thinks is okay and reasonable. Really challenge that mindset and think differently about what is it that you're wanting for your loved one and how you're going to get there, and how do I get them to the point where they feel safe enough to say, I'm okay with this, but I'm not okay with this. And that takes a really long time. It really does. Um, I think also in my experience with working with people who have sustained a brain injury, it's very different, as I'm sure I'm preaching to the the converted, but very different to the general disability in that most or a lot of those people are born with a disability and that's their life. But when we're supporting people that potentially they lived in their own home, they had families, they had kids, they had jobs, they drove a car, all of those things, then all of a sudden they don't have that. Um, Obviously need to take into account there's the grief and the trauma and the significant change to a person's life that they didn't choose at all. They had no control over. And then if you look at other people that I have worked with, on top of brain injury, there's often issues with previous family violence. There's trauma. There's homelessness. There's financial issues. So then I guess, you put a brain injury on top of that, and we focus very much on brain injury, but often it's not necessarily the barrier to other things. So I think it's also taking into account that um, people have lost things. They're grieving, and to get to a point where you're talking about housing and saying, right, what do we need to do? Where do you want to live? What's going to be a good life for you? Is incredibly, I think, difficult. And very stressful, because I think a lot of people think, well, I had this before and now I don't have it, and I don't want to be having this conversation. So I think it's also understanding that in order to build the confidence, it's also being aware of the person that you're working with and supporting, and understanding um, there is no set process for that. And again, that's where I go back to making sure that the tenant is at the center of that, and understanding all of those things that impact and how stressful it can be, but really putting them at the center of those conversations and just working through each issue as it comes about. Again, as I talk about a lot, I think the experience of working through housing options and support options for people is absolutely based on relationships. It, I don't. I mean, I'm sure it can be done, but I think that's the love. That's the love that I have for the job, and the passion that I have is that it's about developing relationships with people, with the tenant, with their support networks, with people that are willing to step in and help out. People that can be honest, people can be they can be real, and also realistic, which is not limiting, but being realistic. Um, but I think seeing the potential in what might be possible for people, it absolutely changes the way that you look at, I guess, what you settle for and what you don't settle for when you're looking for housing options. So when I talk about support staff, in this instance, I'm talking about paid support staff. So any support model that I guess you look at implementing or developing for your loved one um, absolutely needs the right people, the right people. And guess what I've found over the years is that a number of support staff with good intentions can really easily slide back into just providing, I guess, the personal care and doing for, because they think they're doing the right thing. Um, but I think it's really about when you are looking for, I guess, those staff to support your loved one in their home, really making sure that those people have an understanding of the potential, and they're not just there, I guess, to help with showering in the morning, and that's really important to people, absolutely. But I think it's looking at, when you support someone to have their shower every day, then they get out and about and they have confidence in accessing the community and doing what they love. So I think it's really, really important to, I guess, be clear around what kind of support staff you're looking for to support your loved one, and being really clear on, I guess, what you will tolerate and you won't tolerate, and being confident in being able to say, actually, that's not going to work for me. So I don't think you're the right person for this team. I have done quite a bit of work previously as well with how you can support the tenant or your loved one in choosing the staff. And again, a lot of barriers around that, because I guess tenants sort of think, well, I don't want to say anything, because if I say something, I might not get any staff. So I'll just be quiet and I'll take whatever's coming, because I don't want to have no staff, because then that means I won't be able to live in my own place. So it's very much around supporting your loved one as well in getting that confidence in them to say, you can be really clear on the kind of people that you want to come into your home. And there are certain things that, you might think, I'm okay with that, but I'm not okay with that. And a really great example, which has happened a lot over the years, is staff that smoke. And tenants sort of saying, I absolutely don't want a staff member that's smoking. I don't want them to work with me. So, which is completely fine. They get to make that call. But it's also around explaining and supporting that tenant to understand that you can have all these, I guess, rules and guidelines about what you want and don't want. But the reality is, if you have all of those things and you don't find any staff, this is the consequence. So it's not about taking those choices away and saying you have to just settle for whatever. It's about understanding that you can have those limitations and restrictions, but this is the consequence. So making sure that people are actually informed around, when I choose a support staff member, these are the things that might happen, and working through, am I okay with that or am I not okay with that? I think another example that I have, working with a gentleman previously who had a brain injury, um, and he had really great staff. He pretty much liked everyone. That was the kind of guy that he was. But there were a few staff in particular he loved, because when they worked with him at a particular time, they made his lunch for him, which meant he didn't have to do it. And I remember I had conversations with him over, I think, 18 months, talking about, right, you're 40 years old, 40-year-old men make their own lunch. You can do this. We've got all the things in place to support you and assist you in doing that. What's going on? And he was really clear in saying, why would I do it when the carers can do it? Which is fair. But I think the conversations that I had with him were around, you want to live in your own home. You want to have less reliance on other people. So these are the things that are going to get you there. Um, so we did a lot of work with the staff as well around, you think you're going in and helping him by making lunch, but you're actually not. You're not doing him any good. So there was an occasion where the staff went in and this gentleman said, right, you can make my lunch. They said, no, 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 you can make your lunch, but we're here to help you to do that. There's no issue. He then decided he was going to go get Macca's. So he bought Macca's for the whole week. Um, and then realized at the end of the week that, of course, that's his choice to do that. But he said, I put on, I don't know how many kilos, and I had no money. So I guess it's really about working with the tenant and the support staff as well, and in understanding, when you do this, this might mean this, and understanding as well that things change over time. But really, I guess, being informed, and understanding that you might have staff that think they're helping and have the best of intentions, but potentially are not doing the best thing by the tenant. And also tenants that are quite happy to, pretty much live in a restaurant, I guess. So, but it's just working around, what kind of staff are you wanting, and what are the values and the beliefs that they have, and how is this going to be really successful for my loved one. I think too, realizing that, obviously there's a lot of support staff out there, and one size does not fit all. Um, it's understanding that people have different needs, different personalities, and that's completely okay. And support staff are the same, but really, I guess, working on, okay, this is where we want to get to. This is what we're going to focus on. Is everyone on board? And how do we get there? So, um, choosing of support staff, I think, is really important. And as I said, enabling the tenant to really have a voice in that, and to make their choices around that. And also for their family as well. I think it's just as important, if not more, for them to be able to have a say in, well, these are the things that are really important to me. And you might think that's really important, but this is really important to me. So just having those conversations, and having that, I guess, that expectation that's clear, and making sure that you have the right people that are coming into your home, because it's a home. So, I think that's a really important thing. So where to start? This is always a big question. There is no set model that can be developed in the same way each time. There's none. We look at particular models and replicating them, but understanding that everybody is individual. So what works for one person may not work for the next, and that's completely okay. I think in the conversations that I've had previously in working with tenants, it's around starting with what I would say real world choice and control. So focusing on for anybody in the world looking at housing, what are the things that you would look at? Um, I think if you start there, it gets you to think through what implications that has for your loved one, um, and what are the things that you need to work through, and what kind of supports will need to be in place, as opposed to sort of thinking, right, well, this is the minimum and we'll start there. It's about really, okay, this is the ideal, this is the possibility, and then how do we go about that? I think the other thing that I've learned in my experience is recognizing that not everything can be planned. We just can't do it. Um, and that's okay. Sometimes when things are unplanned and they happen out of nowhere, it's a real opportunity to say, okay, I didn't think about that. So, how do we address that and what would we do differently? So, I guess in my role in Melbourne, my role was to support people through their tenancy. And we obviously planned as much as we could, particularly for a gentleman I was working with who had a significant brain injury. He needed the planning, he needed the structure and the routine, um, he needed that to be reinforced, he needed that written down in a certain way. Um, but I think, there were a number of times with that gentleman in particular that things came up that no one thought of and we couldn't plan because we didn't know. But it's around, I think, acknowledging, yeah, that happens because that's life. But now that we know, how do we plan and how do we make sure that you understand what this means, and you get to make the decision in that? I think too, and I mean, there's a number of templates and resources and tools out there around this, but I have found it's really helpful to look at where do you want to be in 12 months or 2 years time. And I think from my experience, 12 months works really well, because anything over 12 months is a long way away, and people sort of lose focus. Because, I mean, I would. Anything over 12 months is a bit much to me, for me. So it's really about, okay, if we're looking at housing options for my loved one or for a potential tenant, where do you want to be in 12 months' time? So, do you want to be in your own home in 12 months' time? Do you want to have a group of staff that you've identified in 12 months' time? Do you want to be spending less time relying on other people? So, there's all of those questions, but it's really about identifying in 12 months' time, this is where I want to be, this is what I want to see in my life. And then it's about working backwards. So, looking at, okay, so where are we now with stuff? What's actually happening? And then it's about bridging that gap. So, to get from where I am now to where I want to be in 12 months, what are the things that I need to be doing? How am I going to get there? And who are those people that I will depend on to support me? Um, and what I find, and I'm sure other people find as well, that often people who experience brain injury are very isolated. They may have limited access to their family, to informal support. So it's all well and good for me to, I guess, sit here and say, yeah, get a network of people and they'll all support you and everything will be rosy. But in reality, there are a number of people that are very isolated, and they don't have those connections in place. Um, so from my experience, it's really about, okay, well, if there is no one in your life that can support you, how do we identify who can support you, and how are we going to bring them in, and how are they going to work with you and walk alongside you to get where you need to be? So that may be the focus of the first 12 months, is saying, okay, this is what I want to do, but there's no one around that can help me, and I need to find people that are wanting to come on this journey, dare I say it, with me, and work through these things. I think, as I touched on before, things to consider. Um, I mean, the classic one is, where do I want to live, or where do I want my loved one to live? Um, so it could be, close by. It could be, I always say near the beach, because I always want to live near the beach. So you're looking at the physical location. Um, what is it near? Do you want to be, I guess, near to your family and friends, or do you not want to be near family and friends? looking at basic things. So if I was going to, I guess, look at having my own home, have I got furniture? What do I need to actually furnish a house? Have I got money to do that? How do I work out what furniture to buy? All of those kind of things that, they're just the practical things. The other thing is looking at what sort of housing are you eligible for. So there's community housing. There are, I guess, rental schemes out there. There's private real estate. There's all sorts of things. So it's, I guess, looking at what is it that you're eligible for. So you don't necessarily spend all this time thinking about an option that you find out, oh, actually, that's not realistic for me. Um, Things around how do you even apply? So, where do you go to get the information? If you were looking at a private rental, how do you actually apply? And I think a lot of the barriers that I've experienced for tenants previously is this whole notion everything's online. And there's a number of people that I work with, they don't do online, it just doesn't work for them. So, I guess looking at, okay, if this is the way to apply, what are the barriers for the person that I'm supporting and how do we get around that? So understanding that, um, like I said, even an online application is really daunting for people and really hard and not doable. So how do you look at, okay, if that's what I need to do, how do I do it differently so my loved one is leading that process? Um, and again, I think a big question is what support do you need to be able to live where you choose? So even I guess the support to identify where people want to live is pretty huge. Potentially, if as I said, they've had a life previously where they've lived in their own place, and now they need support to make that decision. So when I talk support, I don't just mean staffing support. I mean what kind of assistance, what support, what mentoring, what coaching, what do people need to be able to even get to a point where they can identify this is where and how I want to live. Um, and I think obviously the biggest thing is cost. So this all costs money. Um, and it's looking at, again, the practicalities. I would love to live in $1 million property by the beach, but it's not realistic or practical for me. So being really clear about I guess in the situation that you are now, what is doable and what might be a few years' time. But being really clear on, I guess, what are the things that you can control and change, and what are the things that you're a little bit um, stuck with, I guess. So when we talk about transition planning, uh, for me, that statement is talking about transition is, I guess, from um, identifying, yep, I want to move. This is where I want to go, and the transition is okay. All of those things in between, um, and within the housing model that I worked in Melbourne, which is actually called the Abbotsford Demonstration Project, and you can see it online. There's a heap of articles around that. There's learnings from that, and it was done in conjunction with the Summer Foundation and the Transport Accident Commission in Victoria. So there's quite a bit of information on the transition planning, and the research showed that this was a really pivotal kind of component in ensuring the success for tenants. The transition was I guess, the thing that really set them up, which is the role that I was very heavily involved in. Um, and I think the takeaway I take from that is that it's really, really scary. It was so scary for people, particularly. I talked about the gentleman who was living with his parents and then moved 4 hours away. There were a couple of other tenants that were actually living in supported accommodation. So that notion of having someone there all the time, just in case, and then moving into your own place where you potentially have new staff, you've got a new environment, and someone's not there all the time, is incredibly daunting for people and families and carers as well. So I think it's just, I guess, putting that out there and acknowledging that, yeah, it's pretty, pretty scary. Um, what was really successful was involving the tenants really early. So getting out there and meeting them and saying, right, this is where you want to go. How do we get there? And using every opportunity that you can to involve them in that decision making, and ensure that they are leading that. Um, because it really does, it makes all the difference. And I think you create that trust and respect with people, and then they're able to say, hey, I'm actually really scared about this, or I'm really angry that this has happened, or no, I don't want to do this anymore. But if you create that level of respect, and understand that you're there to support someone and not make decisions for them, it makes a huge difference. Um, there's also the notion, as I talk about quite a bit, of safety. And what we found in the Abbotsford project was that there were two types of safety. So there was safety inside the home, and there was also safety outside the home, and they're very different things. And understanding that in order to live in your own home, you need to feel safe. And if you're maybe not living with your family anymore, your family needs to know that you're safe, and the support network needs to know that you're safe and feeling safe. So being safe and feeling safe, I found, are very two different things. So we can say, yeah, the locks are on the doors, you're safe. But if you don't feel safe, it doesn't matter how many locks are on the doors. So there were lots of conversations around what will it take for you to feel safe, and when you feel unsafe, what are you going to do about that? And what support might you need to let people know that you're not feeling safe? One example that I had was the the project that I was involved in had assistive technology. So within the tenants that we worked with, there were a number that experienced a brain injury. There were also a number that had a spinal cord injury as well, quite significant. So I guess if the physical support was not provided in the way that it should, at the end of the day, these people could die. It wasn't just, oh well, that's okay. That they literally could die if it wasn't done properly. Within these apartments, there was assistive technology. So for people that had um, either issues with their physical ability to do things or even cognitively, there was an app on their phone. So they could open and close the doors, they could open and close windows, they could control the air conditioning, things like that, um, which was awesome. So, one of the things that really stuck out as well was that when I spoke to tenants about that, the number one thing they said was, I get to choose who comes into my home, which you think, oh, well, yeah, we do that all the time. But for people that previously had lived in, I guess, a group home, people are in and out of their bedrooms all the time, and there's no knocking; it just happens. But for these guys, the number one thing they said was, I get to choose. Someone knocks on that door, and I either let them in or I don't, and that completely changed things for people. But what we found was that obviously with technology, sometimes it doesn't work. So the level of safety that I guess sort of dropped off significantly when the technology didn't work was amazing. Um, and it was a new thing, it was something very different. So I guess that showed to us that yes, you can put all these things in place and people can be really safe, but when it doesn't work, what's the backup? And how do you work with people to say, when this doesn't work, this is what you need to do? Or what are those other people? What are the roles for other people to do that if those people can't necessarily say, hey, this isn't working. So it's really about establishing, it's almost like a backup of a backup plan all the time. Yes, you've got this makes you feel safe and be safe, but when it doesn't work, this is what we're going to do. So it's really about acknowledging that and working through those as they come as well. Um, what we noticed as well with the transition planning, that people, and a lot of these guys were quite young, very young, so in their early 20s kind of thing, and wanting to get out, get in their own home, and yep, I'm going to cook my own meals, I'm going to do my washing, all of those things. But what we had to really account for was the exhaustion that came in with that. Um, so for some tenants, getting up in the morning and having a shower was that was it for a couple of hours. They needed to have a rest from that. So it's about within that transition looking at, so when you're in your own home, you want to do all these things, that's great. But if you don't have the energy, um, it's really hard to then look at, okay, so I want to go and get a job and I want to go back to study. So it's just again about really acknowledging, um, it is exhausting for people and it's really stressful, and it may be that when people move in to start with, you just focus on those things that they can do and then you build from that. So I guess the transition from my perspective, it was really about understanding what was important to the tenants, and they determined those priorities and then working through each of those things one at a time. So I guess again in relation to safety, um, what I noticed was that it's emotional. It's really emotional moving house. I think years ago I looked and it was in the top three stresses of life is moving house. So if you look at moving house and then you add some complex support requirements and then you add a brain injury and then you add all of those things, like it's unbelievable. Like it's indescribable. Um, so I learned a very valuable lesson within this, and I did a big mistake, but I've learnt from that. So when we initially we supported a number of tenants to go into their own home, they moved in. Three of them moved in on a Friday into their own apartment, um, and me, being the clever person I thought I was at the time, thought, okay, they've moved into their own place. They probably just need time to themselves to settle in, get sorted, do what they need to do. So I gave them space and I gave them a week. So I thought, they know where I am if they need to contact me and all the rest of it. Um, the feedback I got very directly, which was great, was that that was the absolute worst thing I could have done because I've just moved into my own home and you're the person that I've been working with all this time and now you're not there and I can't talk to anyone. So again, it was that notion of safety. And I guess my learning was I thought, well, they know the apartment, they're safe, they've got the locks on the doors, they've got the assistive technology, it's all working. But it was the anxiety around, okay, now I'm in my own place and the doors are shut and I'm on my own. I'm all alone and I've probably never been on my own for many years. And the safety and the anxiety around that was through the roof. So it was a really good learning for me. Um, to understand the notion of safety is, like I keep saying, it's not just about physical safety, it's about emotional safety and and people feeling they're okay, and if they're not okay they know what to do and who to contact in that. um, I think the other thing with safety, and particularly for family members and carers, there's a huge issue of safety for their loved ones when they go into a different model of housing. um, they have fears around they're going to be isolated because they may not call and want to chat with their friends. They might just sit in the house and be all alone. That's a real issue for me as a carer. And there's also that real issue of vulnerability. So I think it's really great that we're looking at housing options and looking at, I guess, people choosing where they want to live and how they want to live, which we absolutely should. But being real around the issues of vulnerability as well. Um, and I think the story before I told about the gentleman that he just wanted to have friends. So he invited the wrong people into his home, and understanding that we can create opportunities and we can increase independence and all of those things, but it also increases risks, and risks for the tenant and also risks for the family members and the carers that may not be physically in that home and being, I don't know, kept up at night thinking, what's happening? Are they okay? It's a horrible thing. So it's really about, I guess, acknowledging them and saying, "Hey, I'm really scared about this," and what do we do so we can all feel safe in this new arrangement? I think too, the safety outside the home. So the gentleman that I was working with, he was he felt very safe within his home, but he said, when I go out, when I go to the shops up the road, I feel really unsafe because people can steal my stuff, um, which is real. It's an absolute, I mean, it happens. Um, but what we talked about was, yeah, people could steal your stuff, and there's nothing really that we could do to stop that from occurring. Um, but what we did talk about was how would we make you feel safer going out and about. And for the initial, when he moved in, it was about, well, I'd like someone to go with me, just as a backup so I can get my confidence up. And then maybe down the track, I won't need them anymore. So again, it's looking at the notion of safety inside and outside, but also looking at, well, I might not feel safe now, but maybe in 3 months or 6 months I might, and it's okay. Not thinking, right, so you're never going to feel safe. You need 24-hour support for the rest of your life. It's around, okay, let's just monitor this. Let's just check in with you and make sure everything is okay. And then we might change it as we go when you, I guess, get your confidence up and feel that, yeah, I might be all right to go out for 10 minutes. So it's really about continually asking the questions and thinking differently about everything. When we talk about carers and family members, they play an absolutely crucial role. So I mean, I often talk about the tenant leading the process, um, but what I've found in 99% of the time is it's the families and the carers that are also absolutely involved and determined and wanting the best for their loved one or the tenant that they're supporting. Um, and I think really acknowledging the crucial role and the important role that you play in that person's life. Um, and I know that saying that's really old, but that no man is an island. This is not something that it's not easy, and to do it on your own is really hard as well. But understanding that um, families and care, like they're just you can't. I mean, you can, but it's really difficult to do it without them. They have so much knowledge, they have understanding, they have context, and they want the best for the people um, that, that their loved one or the person that's supporting. So, I guess understanding that for carers and even family members, it's also really hard. And there's that often that notion of sort of letting go um, and saying, okay, well, I can't control everything, but I just need to know if something does go wrong that there are things in place. And again, we talk about opportunities, opportunities for people to live their own life and to choose what they want to do and how they want to do it. But it also does increase risks for people. Uh, and again, it's around that dignity of risk. So yes, this might be a risk, but how could we potentially minimize that so our loved one is safe and we feel safe for them as well. I think the one thing that I would encourage people is around that importance of planning. And we use the word planning a lot, but it's being really clear about, I guess, where you want to go, what needs to happen, and who's responsible for doing it. Because I think when there is clarity around uh, the roles that people are playing, it builds confidence, and it helps to reduce the anxiety. But it's being really clear around, okay, this is what we're working on, this is what's happening, these are the people that are doing it, and also being, I guess, confident and safe enough to say, I'm actually really scared. I'm really scared that this might not work, that I'm putting my loved one at risk, that I won't know what's happening, that they won't be able to tell people, and acknowledging it's okay, and then working out, okay, right, it's there, it's out there. How do we address it? So, how do we get to a point where I'm not as fearful and I am supporting my loved one in the best way that I know how? And understanding that obviously carers and family members are the absolute experts. You could have all the service providers in the world and the planners and NDIS support coordinators and whatever you want to call them, but it's the family members. They're that support network that are ongoing, they're long standing, they're not going to come in and out necessarily. So, really tapping into, I guess, the expertise that they have and understanding the role that they play um, in in someone's life and how huge it is. So I don't know if you guys have access to the PowerPoint right now, but there was a quote from a gentleman that I worked with years ago. Um, this was after he moved into his own home, and it took quite a few years for him to do that. But he had said, having the right people around me to help me be clear about what I wanted and help me work it out has made me realize that it's possible. Everything's possible. And I think that quote has sat with me for many, many years. Um, because again, it really focuses on having the right people around, because it's a huge thing to look at housing and support and what you want and what you don't want. And you only know what you know. But if you have the right people in place, it's amazing to see what can happen and how people's lives can change. So I think the last quote that I had um, to share with you was to aim high and have ambitious plans for now and the future. So don't limit yourself and don't limit your loved ones. Think about what is the absolute ideal that I want for my loved one and how am I going to get there and who do I need to do that. That's it from me.
Thank you, Joe. I'd just like to remind everyone that if you have any questions, please ask them through the YouTube comments. We do have some questions that have already come through. Um, Before I start, I would like to thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom with us. You've really shown us that the experience of looking for and finding housing for loved ones and needs to be driven by the tenant themselves, and that it's so important that the tenant has support from loved ones and service providers to get what they want. Some of the biggest themes that came through were that the tenants and their support networks need to have high expectations of themselves in the process, and that the tenant should never settle for something that doesn't meet their needs or expectations. Um, our first question that we had is a scenario based question, I guess. It's, is there such a thing as live in carers for someone who lives in and owns their own home? They will need support overnight as well as during the day. Would he need people coming in, or can he source live in carers?
Okay, so you're just so I get that right, you're
Yeah.
talking about someone living in their own home that potentially requires 24-hour support. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, so what I have found over the years is that, and it's largely driven by cost. If people require 24-hour support, the only option is, well, it's a group home. You need to then share with other people. Um, there is absolutely no reason, if that's the support that that person requires, they have their own home, that they can arrange for staff to come in and support them. So within the housing model that I was talking about in Melbourne, um, I think four of the six actually required significant levels of support. They also required sleepover, and that was the arrangement that was in place. So it was determined on the support that they needed, and then the funding was available for them to do that. So I know one gentleman in particular, there was 24-hour support because he had significant physical requirements, but he was in his own home and he was involved in the recruitment of his carers, and that's how it ran. So it was very much based around what his needs were, as opposed to him fitting into a model of support somewhere else. But yes, that's doable, definitely.
Thank you. The next question that we had was if housing and support should be seen as separate and complementary, but the person has NDIS funding for both, do you recommend using different providers for each element?
Okay, so if I talk NDIS language, um, they will refer to the housing as SDA, which is Specialist Disability Accommodation, and the support as SIL, which is Supported Independent Living. So what we're finding with NDIS is that they are very much encouraging that an SDA provider is separate to a SIL provider in order to separate housing and support, um, which I think is actually a great idea, because you don't then have a provider that owns the house determining the type of support that's provided and required. So I think it's great to separate it out. Um, Within supported independent living, now I've forgotten the question, Lisa. That's terrible.
If housing and support should be seen as separate and complementary, but the person has NDIS funding for both, do you recommend using different providers for each element?
Right. Okay. I think it's very much based around the needs of the tenant, and I guess looking at the housing option. So I know within my role at the moment, we have a number of SDA properties where we also provide the SIL, but we also have a number of properties where we just provide the SIL and we're not the SDA provider. So I think, again, it very much goes back to the tenant, and are they wanting separate providers, or are they happy with the same provider? But I think it's doable in both cases. It really is just around what the tenant is wanting, and being able to, I guess, choose the support and choose the support provider, which you absolutely can do. So you can you can almost interview the providers and sort of say, look, this is what I need. Can you meet my needs? So that would potentially help you to make that decision. But yes, they can be separated. Absolutely.
Thank you. The next question was around the importance of a circle of support, which you talked about a lot today. The networks and the family and support. So for those people who don't have an informal support network, who will start the process of finding a support network for them?
Okay. Um, that's a tough one. So there's people that I have worked with in the past, and I was involved in a paid capacity, so I was able to start that. Um, but I guess in order to start it, it's having a conversation with the person. Who are those people in your life? Who are those people not in your life? And how do we get that circle of support established? Um, so I know in previous experience, um, I have worked with a number of people that had very little, I guess, social connections. So for this gentleman, and it was most appropriate for this gentleman, we actually had some paid staff coming in just to support him more with the social stuff, not so much personal care, but they supported him to get out into the community that he chose, and to almost start to develop those networks for him. So what they did was increase his confidence in being able to. The example was that he would go to Woolworths every week. They started the conversations with the checkout person, um, and then over time, that staff member would sort of step out and stand back. So the gentleman got the confidence to talk to that person, and I guess started to talk a little bit about his life, and then that person actually got really interested, and they then developed, I guess, a personal relationship outside of that. So I think it is really hard, and like I said, very easy for me to sit here and say, let's just go get a circle of support for everyone. It's really easy. It's not, um, but I think if you start with one person, and then thinking about what's one connection that I can make for this person, just one, um, and then build on that, and understanding as well that that can take time, a long time. Um, but I guess also realizing that a support network doesn't have to be 20 people, it can be two people. There's no reason, there's no number. It's really about what that tenant needs. And it can also be the support network. They then bring other people in as they go. So if it's difficult for the tenant to, I guess, get out and make relationships and be able to talk to people about what's happening for him, um, just start with one. Just start with one.
Thank you. Our last question. If a person is on a list for community public housing, but there is none available, is it possible to get into private rentals through community housing?
So I'm not an expert in community housing. Um, I'm just thinking of an example that we're working through at the moment. So I have a family member of a tenant. We provide what we call the SIL, but they have their own tenancy. That family are now looking to relocate. They are going through a tenancy manager, but they're also going through private rental. So in relation to community housing, I'm not 100% to be honest, but I can find out and feed that back because it's not my area of expertise.
Great. Thank you, Joe. We'll provide a update on the question once we find out the answers. And for Joe, thank you for the presentation today. For everyone watching, thank you for watching with us today. Our next information session is in October, and it is with clinical psychologist Samantha Grant on managing challenging behaviours. Thank you. Bye.